Well, depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon to everybody with us online. Welcome to the first webinar for the LARC program with the ARLF and our partners. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on different lands across Australia. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, work and live, and recognise that this land has been and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Once again, thank you so much for being here as we introduce our Leading Australian Resilient Communities webinars program. I'll just speak very briefly about LARC. We acknowledge the federal government's funding for rolling out this program. The ARLF has partnered with the Regional Australia Institute and our lead delivery partners across other states, Tasmanian Leaders, Victorian Leadership, the South Australian Institute for Leadership and Western Australian Leadership. So thank you to all of them. Today, our very first first webinar topic is around place-based approaches. And so I'd like to introduce our guests. While I'm doing that, you'll be invited to participate in a small poll. Our first guest is Dr. Susie Moloney, who is the Executive Director for the Centre for Just Places at the Jesuit Social Services, established with the support from the Gandel Foundation and the Victorian Government to enable and support place-based approaches to addressing social and ecological justice issues through research, collaboration, engagement and knowledge exchange. Before her current role, Susie was Associate Professor in Sustainability and Urban Planning at RMIT University. She brings over 20 years of experience working across a wide range of research and policy projects, focusing on social and governance change, local empowerment processes and resilience and climate justice issues. Susie and her team at the Centre for Just Places are committed to working collaboratively and inclusively with a range of partners and communities to support and co-design solutions that strengthen place-based capabilities and resilience. Thanks, Susie, for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice to be here.
Our second guest is Georgie Somerset, who is a rural industry leader and strategist with a background in regional development across Australia. Based in Queensland's South Burnett, she is actively involved in the operation of a family beef business. Georgie has board experience across the not-for-profit government and industry sectors as General President of AgForce Queensland Farmers, a Director of the Royal Flying Doctor Service Queensland, the Foundation for Rural and Regional Renewal, and most importantly for today's discussion, as Chair of the Red Earth Community Foundation. She serves on advisory committees for regional development, tertiary institutions, industry and community groups. She's also a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation, and the Institute for Resilient Regions. Thank you for joining us, Georgie.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
So everybody, as you're watching, you'll see that we have both a chat and a Q&A function. Use the chat function as much as you like in regards to letting people know who you are and where you're from. But if you have questions for either of the panelists, please make sure that they go in the Q&A section just to keep things clear for us so we can respond. So Susie, I'd love to start with you. Place-based approaches is a plural term. So I'm curious around some of the models and methods that may fall into this category from your perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I guess I might just mention some of the research and examples that I'll be drawing on in today's discussion is from a work that we've recently done for the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions in Victoria. The research project was called What Works for Place-Based Approaches in Victoria. So the case studies were Victorian specific, but the literature review really tried to pick up on what the key characteristics and principles of effective place-based approaches are, just from the literature nationally and internationally. I think one of the first things to say is there's not a sort of a universal definition of a place-based approach. One of the definitions that we focused on and drew from was from DART in 2018, and that was a report that was produced by the Commonwealth Government and Queensland Government and Clear Horizon. But just to kind of, I'll give you that definition because it has some key words in there that I think probably are characteristic of what we might call place-based approaches. So the definition they use is a collaborative long-term approach to building thriving communities delivered in a defined geographic location. This approach is ideally characterized by partnering and shared design, shared stewardship, and shared accountability for outcomes and impacts. And I guess there'll be a lot of words in there that will resonate with a lot of the participants in this workshop. Now, whether long-term place-based approaches effectively achieve all of those characteristics is the question, but that's certainly what the ideal would be. The Victorian Government released a place-based approaches framework back in the beginning of 2019 before COVID kicked in. But in that document, they talk about a place-based approach as opposed to a place-focused approach. And I think it's useful just to distinguish the differences. When they talk about place focus, they're really talking about the way in which government or services are adapted to respond to needs in places. But ultimately, the decision-making usually stands with government and with service providers. So the distinction to be made here is that place-based approaches really are about collaborative, grounded, embedded decision-making coming from the community, and that's quite a distinct difference to a place-focused approach. So one thing that we've found in a lot of the discussions we've had is that lots of things get called place-based approaches, and they're not really. So I think that key point about initiatives really being driven by the voices and needs of those in the community is central. How decision-making is shared, how power is shared in communities is also a key feature of what you might call place-based approaches. I guess one other just thing to sort of mention, in our review of what's going on around the country and understanding the different kind, there's a whole lot going on. And you know, we're developing a database at the moment trying to kind of understand the breadth and depth of what might be considered community-led or place-based initiatives. And that can be from community-led resilience responses in response to floods or bushfires or any other community shock or stressor. But they can also be long-term embedded community building exercises. You know, a lot of the initiatives that we looked at could be characterized as focusing more at that social policy end, early childhood, whole of family approaches. There's a whole lot of initiatives that also look at employment pathways, that look at systems approaches to building employment pathways and economic development opportunities. So there's a whole lot of different issues that a place-based approach can focus on. And so we're very careful not to sort of pigeonhole, I guess, what is a place-based approach and what it should be about. The key point really is that it's about a long-term embedded community-led initiative is probably at the heart of it.
Fantastic. There's certainly a lot to think about in what you've just said. So I might flick over to Georgie. So in light of that, Georgie, you sit as the chair of a foundation that works and serves for the community in which it sits. So did you just want to share with the viewers today some of how that happened, the journey, and where the foundation's at now?
Thanks, Andrew. So, and great to hear some of the language that Susie's using, because in a way it formalises some of the ground-up approach that the Red Earth Community Foundation has taken. And we spent about 3 years having conversations around the community to eventually form a community foundation in early 2013. So we're approaching our 10-year mark. And very early, within weeks of having our legal structure, we had the second flood in 2 years in our community, which gave us an opportunity to actually work with the local community and for FRRR to run a flood appeal locally, which meant that we could actually provide local response to people who wouldn't normally be able to access any sort of flood support. They're not considered disadvantaged, but had been significantly disadvantaged by the event. But what we also did was take the lead from another community we'd watched earlier, the Theodore community, and we used local vouchers. So within weeks, we had sort of $55,000 that was turned around into our community spent in vouchers. But that flood appeal raised about $95,000, which allowed us to do some community work as well and build some long-term resilience, but it gave us some profile. What it also led to was a group approaching us, a group of leadership alumni from the Building Rural Leaders program, who offered a small amount of cash, which we then leveraged to run our first community leadership program in early 2014. So annually since then, the Red Earth Community Foundation has run a leadership program. We've run some philanthropic, some fundraising events, we've run some governance, and we're now at the stage of doing some of the things that Susie's just touched on, that long-term co-design for the future of our region, where we're looking at the really, not the emergent, not the urgent, but actually what's going to deliver real resilience into the long term. So that's a really short, the Reader's Digest version of the Red Earth Community Foundation, Andrew.
No, thank you very much. Susie, just back to you. I was curious. So you're looking at a lot of different places and approaches and work that's going on. What have you seen, and what are you seeing in regards to place-based work in Australia that's being done well at the moment?
And again, that's a really, difficult question to answer. I guess what I can, just to kind of give some context around the research that we did. So in sort of reviewing the literature, this is grey literature, academic literature, a whole lot of literature that really tries to understand what would be the characteristics and features of successful place-based approaches. So I can certainly comment on what we found from the literature. In terms of the case studies, we looked at just a selection of case studies in Victoria, and there was, a number of criteria around selecting those. And I think just the caveat really is that there's a whole lot more that you could draw on. But one of the models of approaches that we are seeing more of across the country, and particularly government, federal government likes to invest in these, and that's collective impact models that some in the workshop will perhaps have heard of or have been involved in. So the federal government is running a number of different initiatives, Stronger Places, Stronger People, across the country, and Connected Beginnings that have a collective impact approach. Some of the case studies we looked at included the Greater Shepparton Lighthouse, and that's also collective impact. Go Goldfields in Maryborough in regional Victoria also operates on a collective impact model. The others that we looked at were Flemington Works, and that's about employment pathways, particularly working with refugee communities. And that's part of a suite of initiatives in Victoria around community revitalisation. We also included the Latrobe Valley Authority, which you might consider is more place focused given that it's a government department, but their approach is really about regional transitioning and building the resilience of the Gippsland and Latrobe Valley region, in particularly with industrial restructuring. So and then another one that we included, and we're trying to get some breadth and diversity, was a First Nations-led initiative in Gippsland called The Gathering Place. So I guess what I'm just trying to illustrate is that there's a lot of variation just in that handful of 5 case studies. And we'd certainly, we were not presenting them as a which ones are good and which ones aren't good. It was certainly trying to understand what are the enablers and barriers to those initiatives effectively delivering on what they're trying to achieve. But just to kind of come back to what the research says, would be the key principles or characteristics of successful place-based approaches. I think the six key themes that we extracted. One is the importance of adopting a strengths-based approach as really important. The second is a commitment to promoting equity, and that is equity in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but also equity around decision-making and who's involved. So equitable distribution of decision-making and how you bring and include multiple voices into what you do. A third area that we focused on was effective leadership and governance. And there's a whole lot of different ways in which you can lead and run initiatives of all different sorts, depending on what you're trying to achieve. The fourth point is a commitment to listen and work in genuine partnership with communities, and how then that is reflected in the way you do your work and how you engage with communities. The fifth is the importance of long-term flexible funding and resourcing to improve capacity strengthening. And this will be no surprise to anyone that long-term flexible funding is the dream, and really often one of the key hurdles, because lots of funding that comes through, whether it's from government or philanthropy, might be project or program focused, short term. So that long term funding is really a key issue that comes up, and the capacity for an initiative and a community to adapt and use that funding as required, rather than being fixed to a particular set of program deliverables, which is often the case. And the last point then is having a well-resourced, designed and rigorous evaluation and learning process. Again, often something that's not well-resourced. We found that evaluation across initiatives is quite ad hoc and varies. And often it's about actually building the capacity to do evaluation and learn from what you're doing into the team. And that's something that's got to be supported and resourced. So that's from the literature. There are, a bunch of related themes that came from the case studies themselves and what we learned from those on the ground that really do echo a lot of that. Having trusted relationships in the community and with government was key. Shifting from a place-based to a systems lens was something that a lot of the people we interviewed were trying to do and trying to think about. And moving beyond the problem fix and moving beyond that. And that really relates to that strengths-based approach. How do you particularly a lot of the work at Jesuit Social Services is working with those most marginalized, and also a focus on communities experiencing the most disadvantage. And often those communities are framed as a problem to fix. And there's a really strong emphasis on trying to move away from that and really focus on the strengths within communities. So that's just some examples of
thank you.
In the research.
So, Georgia, in light of what Susie has just shared around what the literature is saying and some of the learnings from there, did you want to reflect on how that has looked for the Red Earth Foundation and in your work?
Yeah, so I'm busy taking notes as well, Andrew, because I think we all keep learning from each other, and I think in community it is about gaining and layering up what others have done and helping to build upon that. I look at that and I think some of those fundamental things, the things that we identified, it's really gratifying as we approach the 10-year mark, that the work we're doing now is really closely aligned to our founding intent. And that's exciting because, in fact, it comes with some funding flexibility. So we're now entering into a 3-year funding program, which gives us some ability to focus on the long term, the 10, 20, 40-year future for our region, which is that moving beyond the problems of the immediacy. And it's what we've always wanted to do, was to invest in our people and think about how do our people co-design their future. And so the Bernard Inland Futures, which is the work that we're really focused on now, is over a 3-year time frame. So it meets some of those things. It's about building those strong governance. And I really love the piece about making sure that we get the evaluation right, because we want to think about how do we ensure that as we go through the process, we're making sure we are true to the intent of what we were planning to do as well. Foundationally, I think a community foundation gives you an opportunity to put in place really strong governance and leadership, and the leadership that exists beyond local government and agency employment. And in my term, I've had 3 mayors across the 2 major local government areas and 2 mayors in the Indigenous community that we're working with. So there's 8 different leaders that are positional leaders, and yet our board is fundamentally still focused on the same things that we were 10, 11, 12 years ago when we first started the conversation. And I think that's the thing where something like a community foundation can really provide a strong place-based approach with strong local leadership And we've just gone through some more board recruitment recently, and our last 3 rounds of board appointments have been through an expression of interest, and also helping our community realise that these are not popularity contests, they're not elections. We're actually being really strategic about and interviewing people about what will they bring to the table and what's the leadership role that they want to play and the governance they want to contribute to our region. So I guess I'm seeing resonating in the work that we're doing. We've still got some work to do though, because we don't have Indigenous leaders on our board, and we have some work to go in terms of our Indigenous leaders feeling as though they've got the place at the table and the seat at the table to do that co-design with us, and we're working through that process at the moment. And we really clearly got the feedback through the leadership program when we had Indigenous participants identify that it was lonely to do that alone. And so there's a need to make sure that when we have any sort of minority group, I think, unless they're very strong, we have had, as you would know, Andrew, a really strong migrant participant. And his personal strength and what he was able to give to the program was significant. But I think often we overlook that it can be a really lonely thing to be doing leadership as a minority group, and we need to support and scaffold those people as much as they go on their journey. And so we're trying to be really thoughtful and really deliberate about how we do that. And our young people as well, but we have a lot of people in their 20s who are contributing significantly to the work that we're doing. And so I'm really encouraged with that. And it's about how do we engage the next level down in terms of those in their teens that are thinking about their future. So I guess I look at that and think that the genuine partnerships are so important for the work that we do. And I guess I've encouraged others that this might take time because you have to have the conversations, but that's okay. If we tried to do some of the work with Red Earth sooner, it wouldn't have been the right time. And so, in fact, as leaders, we need to be patient to take the community with us on the journey, because we can often see over the horizon and we can see where we need to be, and we need to take the time to sit in the space and provide a space that's safe for others to sit in so that they can journey with us. And I'm really comfortable that not only do we have more broad support from the community because we've taken longer time, but we also have a board that's really comfortable with where we're going and the deliberate action that we're taking. So I think that there can be a degree of frustration that things don't happen soon enough, but they do happen, and we just have to be focused on the long term. And this is the breaking out of the cycle of 3 to 5 years. Resilience isn't an 18-month, that's recovery, that's immediate response. Even 3 years to me, the resilience is a 5, 10, 20, 50-year journey. And one of our founders likes to talk about the 100 years and what will our grandchildren's grandchildren inherit in our place. And what will be our legacy and how we've contributed to the region that they'll inherit. And they can be really guiding principles to think about to get you out of that 3 to 5 year funding cycle or planning cycle or the 12-month funding. And I think the funding is really critical. So trying to limp along on 12-month windows can be incredibly restrictive. And now having a 3-year window gives us a chance to lift our eyes to the horizon. But to be honest, that 3 years will go in a snap. So we need to work collaboratively with funders. And we currently have funding. We're working with FRRR, but it is the Preparing Australia through the National Emergency Management Authority. And I think that's really exciting that they're thinking about how do we prepare Australia? We have to take that longer term view. So the more that we can collaborate across government, industry and community, and just going back to what Susie was saying earlier in the research, we're talking about co-design, which is similar to the place-based approach. And we talk about the backbone structure, which is the one that we've drawn on significantly is what happened in the Appalachians. And I like to think about a backbone as when your backbone's working well, the rest of the body just hums. And when your back's a bit out, you can't quite pinpoint it, but the arms or the legs or even the head don't work as well. But when the backbone is strong and consistent and holding everything up, people can go about their work. Your arms and your legs and your head and your brain can just do their things. So we as a community foundation don't want to be the ones who do everything. We want to enable industry. We want to enable agency. We want to enable community. We want people to be able to come and invest and drop a seat at the table in whatever way they can contribute. But we don't want to have to be the doers. And I think that takes a significant shift in thinking for people, because they immediately think that an organisation is going to do it all. But in fact, we want to provide that space that others can do in a coordinated fashion, so that we haven't got two left arms and two left legs, and that we're actually thinking about the long term, and we're using our resources, human, natural, financial, social, really cleverly to build that place in that region.
Fantastic. Before I flick back to Susie again, I just want a follow-up question for you, Georgie. You mentioned before that as leaders, we can sort of see over the horizon or have an idea of what we think where we need to go, but that the wisdom was in sitting with community and people and waiting. In the sitting and in that groundwork, when you got to the next horizon, did you discover any things that you weren't expecting or that surprised you, that you didn't anticipate?
That's a great question, Andrew. I think for me, the strength of being a leader is not having all the solutions. And so I like to not try and imagine what the outcome might be. And that's been, I think I used to try and design it and then have people fit into my design. But what I've learned to do is to actually come into a space not knowing what the outcome's going to be. And that's what's really exciting, is that I don't actually know. And we had a leadership forum in July, and people saying, what do you want to get out of us? Well, it's going to be up to people. We spent 3 hours of that day asking people what they wanted for their region. We let them divide into different streams and put their ideas forward. I wanted to just provide a space where they could come together. But I think as leaders, it's so easy to fall into wanting to control and design and contrive. And the much more powerful piece is when we actually just provide the space and orchestrate the conversation, because I think it will always be far bigger than we could ever imagine. And that's what I'm seeing now, is that what I imagined co-designing our future might look like has become much bigger, because we've allowed others to take control and to have their agency. And I haven't tried to be in every conversation. And that can be really challenging as a leader, to let go, particularly if you've got a vested interest, from your heart. But in fact, it's like having children. And I always say that leadership it starts in the family. It starts when you're a child, and parenting is one of the biggest leadership challenges ever. And one of the biggest challenges as a parent is letting them go. And the same thing I think in this sort of leadership in community, because we're so heart-led often in our regions, is actually letting it go and letting it get its own legs and become more than you could ever have imagined. So my challenge to other leaders is to probably not design the outcome, and to be constantly surprised and constantly inspired that others will buy into the vision because they've got a place at the table.
Thank you. That's awesome. Susie, just referring back to something that you said before, which was really great about, not looking for what is good and what is bad, but being able to identify enablers around place-based approaches and barriers. Could you tell us a little bit about, what you're finding in the case studies, in the research, what some of those enablers and barriers are?
Yeah, I mean, just before I do, I think Georgie just sort of really beautifully defined power sharing right there. That sort of, and I guess what comes through in that point, Georgie, is that how important trust is, and how important building trust with those that you're working with, and the other leaders that you are sort of enabling and building through the work you do, so that you can let them lead, and that's the power sharing aspect that is easier said than done, I think, but it's a really key feature of the work. In terms of enablers and barriers, I mean, we because the research was commissioned by the Victorian Government, there was a really strong focus from them to really learn how government can improve what it does and doesn't do. So there's certainly a lot in the research that, and I guess I should just say that there's 2 reports that we've produced, and we will be able to share with everyone at the end of November. We're just in the final stages of designing them, actually, but the content is there, and I think great bedtime reading for everyone over the next year, because there are a lot of characteristics and features, and a lot of what Georgie is talking about is really very much coming through in the work. I think one of the things that we sort of tried to draw out a little bit was sort of speaking a little bit to what Georgie was talking about around the different phases of place-based approaches. So your establishment phase, the consolidation, the longevity, and then your sort of eventual outcomes, and thinking about things in those terms. And in that, we sort of identified a number of what you might call features or findings in those phases that you would like to see. And so, for example, having sort of sound and formalized governance arrangements is a key aspect of what many, I guess, where a lot of the energy is in the early stages, how you get effective communication, who's working together, what are your arrangements, and sort of Georgie spoke to some of those aspects. So defining roles and people understanding responsibilities in the way that you work collaboratively, whether you have a backbone or not. But and a backbone doesn't have to be one organization. It can be a collection of people and organizations. Some other enablers, I think, are around having a clear vision and a mission and a theory of change and guiding principles. And these come through a lot in the literature around how you think about your mission and and who's involved in helping shape those visions. Another aspect, and this is probably in the early stages of establishment, is trying to kind of work on small wins so that you build a bit of momentum. And I guess this is trying to kind of have a shared sense of purpose in the early stages without losing sight of those long-term focus objectives that, again, Georgie was talking about. Having a lead organization or agency to help coordinate and convene. Someone does need to take some leading role, and that's another key part of an enabler. And as I mentioned, flexible funding and adequate funding. And I guess one of the things that came through in our interviews with those delivering initiatives, there's a lot of work just involving getting money in, and you know, that's often not paid for. So and this gets back to that point around government needing to recognise that the administrative work in keeping initiatives going over time, and often when they're funded to deliver a project, that sort of grant writing and application work is just not considered core business, but it actually is. It's core business to the ongoing sustaining of any initiative. So there's a lot of advice to government in the research that we've done, particularly around the way in which government needs to think differently around the way it funds projects and initiatives. So yeah, I think, does that give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the enablers and barriers?
Yeah, absolutely. That leads to my another question for you, Susie, and Georgie spoke to it a little bit, but I suppose the style or kind of or practice of leadership could be either an enabler or a barrier, and we've spoken about trust and the sharing of power. Is there anything else that you'd say about the kind of leadership that best fits with what we're talking about?
Yeah, look, I mean, leadership actually comes through as a really key ingredient in an effective place-based approach. And so we've got sort of a number, I'm afraid, you know, there's actually a lot of content in these reports. So I'm only giving you a flavour and absolutely happy to share this. But I guess just to think about leadership through a couple of different lenses. One is that individual leadership and the skills and competencies that you have and that you develop. And that's what this leadership training workshop and series of workshops is about, as well as the work that Georgie is doing in investing in leadership training. There's then organizational leadership, again, different kind of leadership skills in that space. And then this concept of place leadership. And I think just given that we're talking about place-based approaches, just to kind of consider what place leadership means. The definition of that is really around, again, promoting that as a place leader, you are promoting a longer term intergenerational view, that you're looking above and beyond the horizon and thinking about the place in which you are embedded and may have grown up in and value and want to see successful and thrive. And so part of that place leadership then is about emphasizing developing young and emerging leaders, because you're thinking intergenerationally. So that long-term investment in capacity building is a key part of what a place leader will be thinking about and doing. From a sort of individual leadership point of view, and reflecting on the characteristics of what makes a good leader, the words like facilitative, adaptive, systems leadership, these words are everywhere right now, and it's again, there's sort of everything that perhaps everyone aspires to, but it's challenging to do. I think being collaborative, facilitative, it's hard work. It's not about gunning ahead and being a dictator with a vision of your own. It's actually about consensus building and doing a lot of collaboration. So when you think about that, then there are a lot of skills that you're trying to build. So, for example, cultural competency. And particularly, when we're talking about working with a diverse set of communities, working in partnership with First Nations communities, that's really, really important. That there are different ways of working and being. There are different ways of understanding a thriving community and leadership in that. And so it's having an open mind, being open to different ways of thinking. Communication skills are clearly key to a good leader. But often what you're doing as a leader is you're facilitating a diverse group dynamics. And so how well you're able to navigate that is really important. So having empathy and mediation skills, these are all, again, characteristics of good individual leaders. And I think, in terms of the work and the concepts you'll be thinking about over the coming months, I've no doubt that these aspects and skill sets will be something that you'll think about and develop. As you were saying, Andrew, I think the next workshop's around co-design. That's a really common example of the sort of method used to really ensure that you're being inclusive in the way that you're making decisions and working together.
Thank you. Georgie, last question from me for you, and then we'll have a look at the Q&A if people have them. So a big part of the Foundation's work, you're now at the Burnet Inland Future Strategy, but have been running a community-based leadership program for coming up 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And doing and investing in emerging leaders to do what some of the things that Susie's talking about. What impact has that had on, because you've got alumni with a greater or lesser degree of involvement and engagement with the Foundation on an ongoing basis. What's that doing for the kind of place-based work, the ethos, what's happening in the region as those leaders come sort of forth on their journey?
Yeah, and look, need to declare that you are alumni of that leadership program as well. And we love seeing our alumni flourish, even when they do leave our region. And I think this is a really critical thing, is that this is about investing in people to be the best that they can be and where they function. And we absolutely celebrate when people do move away and have other opportunities, because that's actually a great reflection on our region, that we're big enough to let you go. I think it's having an incredibly positive ripple across the region. And I think that we came from a point of deficit because we don't have in Queensland a network of community leadership programs across the state like Victoria does. And so I guess I reflected that we used to have a leadership program that grew out of the Department of Agriculture. It ceased, and I could see the deficit there. And I could see a gap for people not to be able to develop those skills, which is what Susie's talking about, so that they can learn to be facilitative and collaborative and understand enough about themselves and what they bring to a group and how they can contribute. Because as much as I see strong, quite forceful leaders, I also see that we miss out on people who don't understand how to be a really strong, quiet leader. And so valuing the introverts in our communities, valuing the creatives, valuing the different voices, and helping them to understand how they can value diversity, so that when they put together a workplace, when they put together a group, when they think about people in their volunteer spheres, that they actually see that difference as an asset rather than a problem to be overcome. And it's been really gratifying to see businesses actually put multiple people through at different levels, for apprentice right up to management, because then we know that those businesses are going to be stronger, but then we also see those businesses impacting into community and taking leadership in community. Look, it's a rare day to pick up the local paper and not see alumni leading some sort of change. And that's right across sports, culture, business, government agencies, and community. And I always say, if all we do is help those people understand more about themselves and their impact on their family, we've done something great for our region. We have some really significant social issues in our region. We have some real challenges around youth unemployment, around substance abuse, around domestic violence and family violence. And so this is not just about creating economic, but it's actually trying to create a nicer place to be, a place that people want to return to, a place that people feel safe in. And so all of those, when we strengthen people's individual voices, we know we will strengthen the region. And the reality is, I mean, I work in agriculture. We know that it's not going to be fully automated. We're always going to need people. And so we've got to keep investing in our people. Our region is strengthened by people, and it doesn't matter how much funding you get or how much infrastructure you have, unless you have the people to bring that alive, our community will not flourish. And so I think it's a fundamental thing that we need to really value the investment in people over the long term, and continue to invest in them on their leadership journey, because it never stops. And one of the things we're doing at the moment is actually investing in facilitation skills, so that as we go through this co-design phase, we will have people who can hold safe spaces for difficult conversations. I talk about the grey, there's black and there's white, but we need to learn to function more in the grey and value diversity and value diverse views. But you need to have the skills to be able to do that. And that hasn't been something that's been invested in widely either. So we're actually using one of our small funding buckets to fund facilitation training, which will enable people to hold those conversations.
Fantastic. I'm just going to flick over to our Q&A. I was going to take the floor then, but we actually had some questions pop up. So the first question is for you, Georgie. Over the last 10 years, have you seen a change in the type of people stepping forward and recognising themselves as leaders?
Yeah, I think we have. And I think we've got more of the quiet, thoughtful people. So in the early days, it's often your own circle of influence. It's people who have already stepped into some leadership or they're wanting some more skills, they're wanting to support it. But what I love now is that although I haven't moved anywhere, I still live in the same place, I often know very few of the applicants for the leadership program. And that excites me, because we're moving beyond our own circles of influence to those that we would never have had influence on before. So I think that we're attracting really the more thoughtful, the quieter leaders. But we've always focused on having a really diverse group. But I do, and I really love it that when positional leaders have the courage to invest in themselves as well. And our intentional focus needs to be on having a more diverse, culturally diverse group that comes through. But people often say to me they would never, because we have people from industry, and when I say industry, we have agriculture, mining, processing and manufacturing. Then we will have government and government agencies. We'll have people from social services, and then we might have people involved in arts and culture. And often those people would never have met each other in normal life. And so for someone in agriculture to learn about our youth unemployment and social disadvantage is really powerful. And similarly, people who've come to our region to work in that sort of sector to understand the impact of flood and drought and the way it eats away at you in the long term and the impact on intergenerational transfer of assets and so forth. So it's always really powerful to see that blend of people, particularly for those who've not had an opportunity to step outside their own sphere of influence or work before. So I think it gives them courage to have conversations with different people, because the leadership program provides that space where it's curated conversation and we do put different people together. That gives them courage to then talk to more people from diverse backgrounds as well.
Susie, yeah, did you want to add comment to that? Yeah,
I was just going to jump in. One of the big areas of work that we're doing at the Centre for Just Places is around climate resilience and climate justice. And I mean, I think it's a relatively new space, because more in terms of how climate change has been thought about from that sort of mitigation angle and regional transitioning, and that's often sort of perceived as a fairly top-down directive set of processes. But a lot of the work that we've been doing is looking at how we're adapting as communities and how we need to adapt, not just from the household level, but through to our organizational practices and agricultural systems and so on. But what that work has done around adaptation is it needs to be cross-sectoral. And so what we're really focused on is trying to build leaders across different sectors. And so a lot of the work includes working with a lot of community sector organizations, health organizations, people in local government. And what we've found in the workshops that we do in bringing people together, and it's really about trying to sort of build an awareness around the kinds of issues that we're going to see increasingly. And by that, I mean how we're going to see heat, for example, impact those already suffering from health issues, or it will impact those who live in poor quality housing. As soon as you start to explore issues with people from different contexts, the issues become much richer, and the capacity to address them, there's more power in that conversation. So I guess it's reiterating Georgie's point around, as leaders, bringing other leaders together from different sectors is really important. You want different perspectives on the issues that you're trying to deal with. And when we talk about a systems approach, that means that you're not just working in your immediate sphere of influence. You're trying to bring in where the power sits and trying to bring those voices into the room. So it's just to sort of reiterate how important, particularly in this whole space of how we build resilience into communities, it has to be cross-sectoral and multi-governmental. It absolutely has to be. Yeah, that was just in reflecting on Georgie's points.
No, good reflection.
Yeah.
I've just got a question here that probably I'll get both of you to speak to. It says, do you think we'll start to see any tension or other dynamic happening around the concept of place leadership with so many people moving into and between regions? We actually heard from our partners at the RAI that that regional Australia is comparatively, compared to other nations, we're quite nomadic. And so there is that movement of people in and out of regions. So I suppose there's that combination of people who've been in a region for 25 plus years and then those who are brand new. So Susie, did you want to comment on that?
I think, you know, the words tension and dynamic are pretty good in the sense that most likely there will always be tensions, because there will always be different agendas that will be in a place. I think that part of the exercise in place leadership is trying to build a consensus around what it is that you collectively are trying to achieve. But then there's also a dynamic in that when new people arrive in, if we're thinking tree change and sea change and all that sort of stuff that we've certainly seen resulting from COVID, but also forced displacement. There's this real issue of communities and people having to shift and change and establish new communities themselves. I think focusing on dynamic is perhaps a good word, in that you're bringing new skill sets into regions, and that can be really empowering and really valuable. But again, it just probably comes back to the characteristics of good place leadership, which is how do you create space for diverse perspectives, and how do you create space for diverse ideas and healthy dialogue, which could be debate, could be tense, but I think being able to work through those processes is most likely going to be a feature of any place leadership, no matter where you are.
And Andrew, I've got to jump in on this one. So it's been really interesting to see. We've had quite a bit of domestic migration in our region. We're only, 2.5 hours from Brisbane, similar from the Sunshine Coast. And I've seen some of those people come through the leadership program, and what they've found is a tribe. They've found a tribe of other people who they probably wouldn't have met normally, who share values and are committed to the region. Like I was a blow-in 30 plus years ago, and I had lots of ideas, and I couldn't believe how this region didn't value what it had. I'd grown up in Western Queensland where we didn't have quite the infrastructure or the community assets that this region had. And people just said things couldn't be done. And so I guess it's been, it's driven me over the years to not have, and so what we've identified in our Bernardine Land Futures report is that our region is essentially the hole in the donut. There's a lot happening around it. So there's a lot happening in a hub and spoke, where the hub will be in Toowoomba and we'll get the leftover, and then there'll be a hub in Bundaberg or Harvey Bay, and we get the spoke. And we really want to turn that round so that the centre of the donut is actually the jam that you're looking for. And we have amazing produce out here to make incredible jams. But I guess it is that bit where and what drove us to look at the leadership program was that there was a real sense of lack of pride in the region as well. And when you're not proud of your own region, it's really hard then when new people come in with ideas, because you've been knocked down so many times. So what I see something like the Community Foundation and the process we're going through being able to do is to actually create a longer table if we need to have space for more seats so more people can be welcome at the table. I see that space for diverse views. I see energy and enthusiasm being welcomed. And the naysayers are still there, but there seems to be a sense of enthusiasm that we can persist regardless. So I'm seeing newcomers investing in our region. I'm seeing multi-generational families building their businesses and investing here as well. And alongside that, people who are willing to sit together to think about how do we overcome some of the really big challenges. I personally think that it's an opportunity, but it's also an opportunity when our people move away, because we then get to stay in touch and learn from other regions as well. So, I think there's a real opportunity for regions, but they've got to be open. They've got to not shut people down. They've got to provide a space at the table, and they've got to have some sort of structure in place, as Susie's talking about, to enable those views to be heard in a way that's supportive and not judgmental as well.
We've got just a couple of minutes left before I have to close off, so I'll ask you it's probably a very complex question, but I'll get the short answer. We often almost sort of polarize the past and the future, in that sometimes we frame the old way of doing things as hierarchical leadership. The authorities will tell you how stuff is done, and they'll determine what services are done and how it's done to you, opposed to the new way of leadership that shares power, that is consultative, that collects voices, and that direction comes from within community. And sometimes our conversations can almost set those two against each other in this narrative of there's real opposition to doing things the new way. In both of your experience, is the opposition that's often indicated in the narrative actually as strong as our dramatic stories can tell, or overall is there sort of a collective agreeable move towards this way of the new way of doing things in your experience?
Georgie, do you want to jump in first?
Sure. Look, I think we dismiss historical leaders at our peril, because I actually think a lot of them were very consultative, but in a different way. So they just had a different way of engaging with the community and making sure they took the community with them. And I stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before in this community leadership space as well. And I learned much from them, in my early days as well. my sense is that if you are embedded in community and you're in touch with the community and you're having those conversations, you will absolutely welcome the way that this is going. And that there are different styles. I mean, in a disaster, you need very directive, very authoritative command and control leadership. The community won't accept that anymore. And so my belief is that, you know, consultative, collaborative, connected ways of leadership will be the way that we go forward. And while you might be able to do it command and control in short term, you won't achieve long-term outcomes, or there will be plenty of friction along the way. But I actually believe we've had many collaborative leaders in the past. They just haven't been known as that. And we've wondered why they were great leaders. And when you go and read their books and their biographies and things, you find that in fact they're incredibly consultative along the way, but they did it in a different fashion. So I think it is the only way to lead is to engage strongly, broadly, widely, and deeply.
Look, I think Georgie's probably answered the question, but I guess what I would say is there is a tension, no doubt, and this is, and I'm thinking here of the command and control aspects of government, and there's no getting around some of that, and I think it depends on what it is you're doing. My background's in urban planning, and that's, while there's consultation and engagement and community involvement in decision making, ultimately it's a legislated process and decisions get made based on sets of legislation. Emergency management's another good example of that sort of command and control approach. But I think one thing that we're seeing really clearly is that in the current moment that we're in right now, where we're dealing with so many intersecting issues, economically, climate, and I think these issues are becoming, they've perhaps been peripheral and they're now centering in people's minds. So when we have a government that's now thinking about a well-being economy and has a broader definition of why we do things and what we're doing things for, and let's hope that becomes a stronger conversation nationally. When we look at the range of disasters that we're experiencing across the country, and people are realizing that only 3% of funding goes into the prevention side of that, there's going to be a real push, I think, from communities and leaders who are doing this workshop to say that it's not good enough. The way in which we're doing things is not good enough. So I think what we're seeing is a strong push from leaders and communities forcing government to change the way they work. There's also a lot of amazing leaders in government, in local governments and in state governments that really want to affect change and are fabulous leaders themselves. So it's also about changing organizational culture. So I guess I would just say, I think there's a movement of change. And while some aspects, there's always going to be a tension around command and control, I think having the voices of communities at the table is much more what people are focused on. And so how do you do that well? How do you bring people to the table, and not in a token way, not just we've ticked, we've talked to them, and now we're going to get on with business as usual. I think there's more of an awareness in communities not to let that happen. So I guess what I would like to see people held accountable for the decisions that happen in communities. And I think that's certainly happening and is going to increasingly happen.
Great. Thank you very much, Susie. We are just about out of time. So to the two people that put in questions just as we were going there, I'll try to get, no, I won't try. I will get to you after we'll get some answers to you. Just to let people know that our next webinar, I believe the details have been put up. It will be on co-design and community consultations. So if you've enjoyed today, even if you haven't, come along to our second webinar. Dr. Susie Moloney, Georgie Somerset, we thank you for the gift of your time, conversation, and thoughts. They were fantastic, and we really appreciate your presence here today.
Thanks very much, and thanks for everyone listening.
It's been great to be part of it. Thanks, Andrew. Great conversation.
Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Bye.